Hello, welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with David Joseph, Mitch J., Felicia Hogan, and George Ortega. And we're going to start out this episode by reading an email that I received from Ken Wright. His first one was, "Hi Chandler, I've been following George's videos on YouTube and find them eye-opening and fascinating. One question, I've had friends commit suicide and I am wondering if that was inevitable. Or Robin Williams, for example. And what if one believes she has no free will and contemplates suicide? Wouldn't that likely push one over the edge? I would think the question of suicide would be common, yet I'm having a hard time finding an answer. With causal will, it seems anyone committing suicide would be destined to that fate. If that's the case, I presume the suicide victim would live a happier life living in the illusion of having free will. Please respond to this question. Thanks, Ken." I find that it's good he asked the question, and I'm sure other people all over the world will have this same kind of question.
It's a great question. It's just a very emotionally difficult one to answer.
Yeah, and I would like to start out with first of all, it's the very idea of not believing in free will isn't by itself going to push somebody into suicide. Rather, there are causes of what already made them feel like committing suicide in the first place, and I would say that realizing that these things are not up to them and that they don't have to self-blame for if they have low self-esteem, for example, that makes them feel like they're bad and deserve to die, as an example. Then it could be that overcoming the illusion of free will would make them less suicidal and give them hope for a better future, which is sort of the effect it had on me. So, does anybody else have a response to that?
I think Mitch responded via email initially, right?
Yeah.
So, Mitch, do you want to go first?
Certainly, I can. So yeah, I agree with you, Chandler. Well said. So we can't control the impact that information will have on us, right? You can discover some new truth, some new bit of information, and it might have a positive effect on you. It might have a negative effect on you. But suicide, as far as we know, is often directly related to depression. And one way in which investigating free will and determining that, rejecting free will, determining that it doesn't make sense and that we live in a deterministic reality, one clear, direct effect of that is that it no longer makes sense to blame yourself because you are not in control of your decisions. You can either be profoundly lucky or profoundly unlucky. Also, by recognizing that we are constantly being affected by internal and external influences, it means we can change. We can become something different. So even if you are something right now, given the right set of circumstances, you can become something else. So if a suicidal person is suicidal because of depression, and that person has investigated free will and breaks it down the way that I just mentioned, breaks down the elements, the reasons behind why he or she has suicidal thoughts, then that person might be able to address the problem instead of just being, stuck in the muck of guilt.
Yes, and I think that's a very important point. Many important points there. The idea that determinism is not the same as fatalism, especially since there are causes, and by looking at the causes of what might be making someone depressed and feeling suicidal, that looking into that is perhaps a step at eliminating those causes or making some kind of corrections that could improve their life.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. So yeah, that's a common thing that happens, right? Like uh, open-minded people, skeptical people, when they investigate free will, oftentimes they're unsure as to what the consequences are. They go, okay, if free will isn't true, if it doesn't make sense, if it's incoherent, if it's an illusion, what does that mean? What does it imply, and what doesn't it? So, like you said, and as I said earlier, determinism is not fatalism. Just because everything is caused by something else, that doesn't mean that life isn't meaningful or that you can't do things. In fact, it means things will be done despite uh, despite what you want to do. It means the universe will just continue to move. So it's not as if you are choosing to commit suicide because you think life isn't meaningful anymore due to this new information. Rather, it's new information is affecting you, and it could lead to a positive change or a negative change. And I agree with you, Chandler. I would argue that the logical thing is that it should be a positive change for all the reasons that we just mentioned.
Yeah, and there's something else, guys, that goes on, and perhaps you've come across this. Somebody will commit suicide, and then people will say, well, they were selfish. They were selfish by choosing to commit suicide, and they deserve to go to hell.
That makes me so angry.
Oh, it makes me angry too, and I've heard that all my life, and my mom's heard that kind of stuff. And anybody who has any experience with depression, and anybody who's been that way themselves, they will know that that's not what's going on. First of all, nobody's freely choosing things. Second of all, they're not necessarily being selfish. Often they just have such a low sense of self-worth that they think everybody else is better off without them. They think they're doing the right thing, even if they're not.
And I want to get into another reason besides the self-blame that free will kind of encourages in people that would lead them more towards suicide than not. Basically, yeah, when people when things don't go the way we want, I don't think anybody's exempt from that. But when a person blames themselves, that it's kind of like anger turned inward, which leads to depression, which leads to just feeling passive and powerless. Whereas like something else that happens is that like, all right, the free will belief encourages us to believe that our failure, our life, being up to us, that we are doing this to ourselves, and like, now imagine somebody whose life isn't going well, and then somebody else tries to do something to their life to kind of like, make something fail or something. In other words, like if the threat is coming from outside of us, I think we have far more of a tendency to fight back, to defend ourselves, to become active. Whereas if we perceive the threat is coming, or the failure is coming from ourselves, then I think that far more leads to this passive, like giving up, the suicide. So
I
it's
can
not just the self-blame. It's placing the locus of control on us instead of on whatever is making us, do or not do whatever.
That's a great
well,
point.
I wouldn't say that having the internal locus of control is a negative thing at all. I don't know if you're attempting to use the clinical, like psychological definition of locus of control, or if you're just communicating an idea there, but I have to disagree with that particular point. However, you're describing about how the the feelings turn inward really hit a chord with me, because I know that's something that I have personally experienced, and I do want to get a little bit personal here. First of all, if Ken is listening, Ken, I want you to know that I'm very sorry for your loss. I I haven't lost a family member or a friend to suicide. I've known some who have attempted but not succeeded, and I can only imagine how painful that would actually be to go through. And I want you to know that you're in my thoughts, as well as the families of these people that you knew. And the second, I want to say, this is something that I have personally struggled with my whole life. Depression, clinic, like our chemicals just in my family in general are completely out of whack. My mom used to say that we have the medicators and we have the self medicators. So there was a lot of drug and alcohol abuse in some of the extended members of my family. My immediate family were the medicators, and so my mom was on antidepressants. I'm on antidepressants ever since sophomore year. My sister was on antidepressants way earlier in elementary school because her depression was so bad. I remember in seventh grade, I felt so alone and so worthless that I used to keep a knife in my socks, in a sock, in my sock drawer, because I thought it would look suspicious if I suddenly walked out of my room to go get a knife. So I had it there just in case. And there were several times that I remember holding that knife up to my heart and debating with myself whether or not it would be worth it. And recently, my uncle sent me some of my journals that my parents still have. My parents and I aren't speaking any longer, but they still have some of my stuff. And so my uncle mailed me a bunch of journals to Tennessee from New York. And I found one of my journals from around the seventh, eighth, or ninth grade. And amongst the prayers begging for forgiveness for normal human teenage emotions, as I learned about sexuality, not from school, mind you, we never had sex ed, so that would be Google mostly. So amongst just the guilt, if I wasn't writing about the guilt, then I was praying for God to let me die because I couldn't take living like that anymore. And so I would definitely say that the belief in free will, the guilt, the feeling of worthlessness and like it's my fault that I don't have friends or that that people don't like me or my parents this or that, turning inward I think is a lot more harmful than anything about free will. I don't think that free will was directly tied in into any of my suicidal episodes. And knowing that I don't have free will hasn't stopped any suicidal episode because I've had a couple since I became an adult where life was just really, really bad and it seemed like nothing could go right. And um, knowing that it's not my fault doesn't necessarily make that any better. That doesn't necessarily stop a feeling of worthlessness. Um, I, there's way more to it than that. However, not believing in free will has definitely not been detrimental to me in any way. It's helped me to learn to forgive myself, and that really is one of the biggest steps for me in recovering from my depression and my religious background is not only learning to forgive myself for what I've done, but for also allowing other people to hurt me. Letting go of the blame and the feeling that it's my fault, one thing or the other, has helped me so much. That doesn't mean that other things don't affect me, like losing a job or relationship troubles or the fact that some people at my work simply cannot work a case correctly to save their lives. It doesn't mean those don't affect me, but definitely not believing in free will has affected me in a positive way. And even though it's not directly associated with my depression and the things I've gone through, I honestly think that's helped. Is suicide predestined? That really depends on your focus. If you're focusing on you and your friends, from our point of view, no, it's not. If you were to zoom out, I guess, and look at time as a whole, you could say it is predestined, but that doesn't mean that what you do doesn't help or doesn't hurt. Whether or not you help or hurt, that I would say that's predestined just as much as anything else is. But I would say it's more deterministic than fatalist. And if you know somebody who's having suicidal thoughts, there are things you can do to help, and there are websites that you can go to help you learn how to help this person. And I think that wherever we post this video, we'll have some links to there in the description.
Yeah. Was that all, Felicia, or?
No, that's all.
Okay, yeah, that was very very emotional, very serious. I agree with some things you said there. First of all, there's still bad things to happen that still upset us and can lead us to depression, as well as the chemical imbalances and stuff like that that happens, and so that part of it actually has nothing to do with the free will belief exactly. But also at the same time, like you said, and I think I can relate to, is that when you no longer are blaming yourself for for, like you said, what you might have done or what you allowing other people to hurt you. When you realize it's not your fault, that seems to be a positive thing. The main thing is that, if anything, overcoming the illusion of free will, it makes it better rather than worse, because it may not change the circumstances of your life, which will be different for each person, but at least you won't direct that at yourself and think that you are the problem, that you're the source of your bad life. And because if you believe that you are the source of evil, then suicide might look like, oh, you are eliminating the source of evil if you think that's yourself. But since you are not the source of evil, then that, at least in my mind, demotivates the idea of suicide, if that makes any sense.
It kind of depends on what the motives are to begin with, because mine were never that I thought, not directly because I thought I was bad, but just because I was in so much emotional pain.
Yeah.
It's an emotional thing. It's not, you can't say that suicide or depression is logical. It's not.
Guys, we've been addressing naturally how, free will belief impacts the person considering suicide, perhaps attempting it and all. How about, like, does anyone want to address the effect it has on, let's say, a friend of ours has committed suicide? I mean, like, the free will belief would seem to play a role in that also. Mitch, David, do you have any ideas on that?
Well, I guess the friend could feel that perhaps they were to blame themselves. Perhaps they could have done otherwise or convinced the person to do otherwise. But we know that causality doesn't really allow that.
Exactly. So again, like, a lot of people are walking around with this, like, very undeserved guilt, undeserved sense of responsibility for not doing what they thought they should have done, or doing what they thought they should not have done. And it's all, coming from this misguided belief in free will.
That's a very good point, because somebody, if they have a friend who commits suicide, yeah, they, like David said, they might blame themselves for it and thinking, well, if only I had done this, or I should have, or could have, would have done this. So then they blame themselves, and that gets them all depressed. So yeah, so the main point is that it also, even though I think that that realizing that we don't have a free will demotivate some people from suicide, depending on the case. It also helps the survivors who might be feeling guilty that they didn't do enough to persuade somebody to live rather than kill themselves.
Yeah, I think Felicia made a good point when she said that it's not logical. If someone has obsessive compulsive disorder, the person doesn't want to wash his hands 30 times a day. The person is probably aware that they're not making an impact in terms of destroying germs after washing your hands excessively, but it's a compulsive behavior. They have no control over it. But despite that, I definitely think it's a step in the right direction. It should be. I'm not an expert on the subject, and Felicia's testimony there was really. I thank her for that, for sharing that very personal
Experience.
yes, but I would agree with Chandler in the fact that the only way to proceed really is to try to make positive steps in the right direction. And the only logical way to proceed, I mean, you might need help from it. The person themselves, the person who is depressed, who is suicidal, probably won't be able to accomplish this on his or her own. But the only way to proceed is to try to analyze the factors that have caused the depression and try to treat those factors.
That's a great point, Mitch, because under free will belief, many people just conclude, well, I think and feel the way I do because of my free will. Nothing's causing me to do it. It's just my free will. And they don't look any further. Whereas to the extent they understand that everything has a cause, that there's a cause for how they feel, that there's the cause for the thoughts they're thinking, then they're much more motivated to seek out these dysfunctional, or these misguided, mistaken, unnecessary kinds of, like, thoughts and feelings, certainly painful ones. And that kind of inquiry, I think, leads much, I think, more quickly and effectively to growth and to overcoming that than simply just like, well, saying, oh, I'm feeling upset, I'm feeling like, I'm blaming on myself, and I'm just doing it for my free will. There's no reason beside that. The free will belief just kind of like, it squashes any kind of inquiry into the causes of why we are the way we are.
And I would like to say that sometimes a person, although I agree that in general, suicide is not a logical thing, it's not some kind of thing that is philosophical and logical and makes a lot of sense. But in my case, it was sort of in that direction. I would say it was more from the religious indoctrination, the idea where you're taught, oh, you're an evil, dirty, rotten, wretched sinner, and you deserve to go to hell forever, and all that idea. And I think that negative message is what led to so much of the self-hatred and blame that I had. And so my life, significantly improved after I got out of that system of Christianity, which is heavily free will based. It's based on the idea of deserving this or deserving that, and I think it leads to this idea that you are bad, you're a sinner, you deserve to go to hell, you don't deserve anything good. And so I think in that's certainly not the case for everybody, but in my particular case, that was the bulk of it. And it happened more through just reading about different religions and about through thinking over time, quite a long process, but I experienced quite a major change, for since I was about 24 years old, and I started really questioning that. So sometimes it's simply an incorrect belief system that we've been taught our whole lives, and by realizing that certain things are incorrect or incoherent, that can help remove one of the causes of depression.
I agree.
I think we should revisit Ken's question about is it predestined? And I'm kind of interpreting that question to extend a little bit further than the yes or no, is it predestined, to mean also, is there anything I could have done?
Well, okay, so here's the thing. So this is another issue. Okay, so very closely related. So, as I was alluding to previously, people get confused about. First of all, for some people, just the term free will can be very confusing. And of course, in a different day, I would argue why it's so confusing because the idea itself is incoherent, which is why people are confused by it. But putting that aside for now, people are really confused about the consequences of it. So we're confusing determinism with predeterminism, with predestination, with so just because everything has a cause, that doesn't mean that there is an entity that is aware of what will happen. So if there is no entity that is aware of what will happen, then saying something is predetermined doesn't really make any sense. It's not really that it's predetermined. It's that there's a constant, the universe is constantly moving, things are happening. Cause and effect is repeatedly going over and over again in a cycle, just like dominoes pushing against each other. But in order for something to be predetermined, there's a strong implication that there has to be someone or something that is aware of what will happen. No one is aware of what will happen. So there's not much meaning to the term, in my opinion.
I think a more precise term may be inevitable. In other words, like once something has happened, then we can label it as having been inevitable. It had to have happened. There's no way it could have happened any other way. And that kind of like, that sidesteps the attribution. Now, Dennett, I think, argues against inevitability, but his argument is like, before something happens, we can't say that it will inevitably happen or not, because it hasn't, we haven't gotten to that point. But again, once it's happened, once a person has either survived a suicide attempt or attempted suicide, then we can clearly say that that action was inevitable. There was nothing that, because of the causal chain of events, the universal, evolution of causes that the person could have done to change the outcome. And so again, that kind of like that explains what happened in a way that doesn't bring in an entity or a consciousness that would explain it.
Yes, this idea of something being inevitable is something that we can only say for sure of something that happened in the past in hindsight, because we know what actually did happen. But yeah, I generally dislike the terms inevitable or predestined or predetermined in relation to people predicting future events. Because if they have this belief that, well, this person is predestined, that they're going to kill themselves, then that leads them to this idea that nothing that they will do can stop it, which is simply isn't true, because that basically, like, I think the term predestined specifically has a religious connotation, that it is God's will and there is a perfect plan, so whatever happens will happen and no human can change that plan.
It's a very good point, Chandler. That's exactly right. When people use that kind of language, predestined, destined, predetermined, it's really more about the future, ironically, or counterintuitively. It's really a statement about what can be done in the future. But this is really looking at the issue of free will, the incoherence of free will, the illusion of free will, the wrong way. Because, as I mentioned earlier, because of the deterministic reality of the world we live in, we are constantly being pushed and pulled by influences. So you can become something different. There is no control, but if you are fortunate and the right set of circumstances come about, you can become something else. You could be the person who is suicidal right now and becomes the person who gives the lectures to help people stabilize and readmit themselves into society a week later. You don't know we don't know what kind of person you will become, but you can become that person. It is possible. You are just matter and energy that is constantly being shifted.
I would only say that I will use the term inevitable. I think, George, that definitely has a different connotation, and I like that one a lot better than predestined or predetermined. But I think that whatever does happen is or was inevitable. However, we don't know what that outcome is going to be ahead of time, which is why we can and should take steps to make it a favorable outcome.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yes, and the important point is that the reason something becomes inevitable is partly because we are trying to produce the outcome what we want, and we all have a basic knowledge that what we do does make a difference, and that's why it's inevitable. Not because of fate or God or something, but it's just that us and our will, which we didn't choose, we didn't freely will our own desires, but what we do does make a difference. And so we can still feel confidence in that sake that if we have a desire to help people and to help ourselves get out of our own depression, then it can happen. So that's good news.
Sounds good. Chandler, we're at a bit over the 31 mark. I think we've covered this topic, not just from the perspective of the person considering suicide, committing whatever, but also from the people who are left behind. So you want to wrap it up, or?
Yeah, sounds real good. Okay, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs, David Joseph, Mitch J., Felicia Hogan, and George Ortega, and we talked about the aspects of depression and suicide, and also the confusion between determinism and fatalism. So I hope that you've learned something from this episode, and you can send us questions or comments. We'll make sure you can do that. And well, hope you've enjoyed, and stay tuned for more. Bye.